and development forums on biocultural conservation and helping us to reflect on how we can apply biocultural approaches here in the University of Florida. Today's event is going to focus on biocultural conservation in higher education. And we have we're going to actually have two speakers. First, our own Andrea Chavez is going to talk about some of the work that we've been doing here at UF. And then we have a distinguished visitor who has been here since yesterday until tomorrow. We have had several really interesting meetings with grad students and with faculty. David Zandvliet from Simon Fraser University. He's in the education department, the education school, education faculty. He has a lot of experience that he's been sharing with us about community university partnerships, place-based education, field schools, all incorporating Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing and being. So welcome to David. And just before I start, I just wanted to share some information about a letter to science that a group of us, many of you here, have recently submitted as a response to an editorial that was written by Robin Wall-Kimmerer and Kyle Artell called Time to Support Indigenous Science. And we've been consulting with experts in the field of biocultural conservation for several months now, and we have a really nice network exchanging ideas and learning from each other. And so the signatories of this follow-up letter were Francisca Saavedra, our alumna consultant and who has been coordinating this process, Tita Alvira, Simone Ataidi, myself, Andrea, Jeff Gano Halida Corntassel, Cherokee Nation citizen and Indigenous Studies professor at University of Victoria, Rachel Dax from the University of Hawaii, Chris Dunn from Cornell Botanical Gardens, Christopher Filardi from Neotero, Mike Gavin from Colorado State, Harim Ali Kassan from Cornell University, Louisa Mafi from Terralingua, Faisal Mullah. That's our first speaker was Faisal Mullah. Our next speaker will be Louisa Mafi and collaborators. Anna Porzakansky from the American Museum of Natural History, Paula Unger, who was our last speaker from Field Museum, Corinne Vriesendorp, also from Field Museum, Kawika Winter from Hawaii National Estuarine Research Reserve, David Zandvliet, who is our speaker today, and Betty Loisel. And this letter is called Time for Academia to Support Indigenous Science and Equitable Conservation. So Kimmerer and Artell, the editorial I mentioned, assert that recognition of Indigenous science and Indigenous knowledge systems is overdue and imperative. Their call to action is significant given the struggle to decolonize conservation policies worldwide and the dramatic state of biodiversity decline globally. Based on our analysis of US and Canadian academic institutions in advancing Indigenous knowledge and biocultural conservation, we maintain that this will require significant institutional, political, and epistemological reforms in the academy. For academia to effectively value the contributions of Indigenous knowledge systems, it must first grapple with its history of colonization and expropriation of Indigenous lands, waters, languages, and genocide. This is especially true for USA land-grant universities that benefited from the Morrill Act of 1862. In addition to the new Center for Braiding Indigenous Knowledges and Science, which Kimmerer and Artell refer to in their editorial, academic institutions, like all of us, need to respectfully engage Indigenous knowledge systems and governance in science, curricula, and pedagogy. It is the role of academia to train the next generation of scholars who understand Indigenous worldviews, philosophies, protocols, and practices, and offer those perspectives to their students. Resources must be devoted to co-creating and implementing biocultural conservation approaches learned from Indigenous and local knowledge holders who have historically been effective stewards and protectors of their environments. A biocultural lens to education and outreach is in its infancy at many academic institutions with respect to formal structures, curricula, and transdisciplinary engagements. Yet true transformation will require fresh ways of thinking, learning, and doing. Indigenous knowledges are usually transmitted from elder to grandchild or from master to apprentice through sophisticated systems that involve storytelling, ceremony, protocols, and land and water-based practices, a sharp contrast to conventional education systems. A Hawaiian saying summarizes it well: "Pa'akwaha nana kamaka halohe ka pepeo hana kalima." And my apologies for massacring that Hawaiian statement, but it's translated as "shut the mouth, look with the eyes, listen with the ears, then do the work with your hands." So with that background, today we're going to talk about some experiences and approaches that will help us thinking about how to put this into practice. And we'll start with Andrea and then pass it on to Doug. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. I think this was a great step, kind of like especially for what we're doing here at the University of Florida, the Tropical Conservation and Development Program, to think how to move on with the role of academia, and especially in working for biocultural conservation. So we're kind of like dealing with our online participants and our in-person participants, and I apologize for all this kind of like technical. But I think what I would like to do is I would like to give a short preamble as well to David's master presentation of today, which is called Biocultural Education: What kind of curriculum is needed to advance biocultural conservation in higher education. And for this, I would like to situate the work of the TCD program, the Tropical Conservation and Development program, within this conservation approach. And I'm gonna now go next to my agenda, where I would like to kind of like to talk about the TCD trajectory, kind of like to situate it first. And TCD has been working in the field of, in the field actually from biocultural conservation, I would say without knowing it in reality, kind of like now with all this new work in biocultural conservation, but it has been working with the biocultural diversity and looking into the different values and knowledge of people in different regions in the tropics and as well elsewhere, because TCD works not only in the tropics. So the programs has housed a lot of students which come to the program with tremendous experience on the ground from the field, with skills as well, working on this sensitizing concept, specifically of biocultural diversity. And some of them, they become as well pioneers promoting biocultural conservation in their professions. And so that's why we have this enormous skilled TCD alumni all over the world as well. So I think TCD then, as I was saying, is already a pioneer in itself of biocultural conservation. As you see here, my agenda is kind of like, hopefully very brief, but I think I will refer then to the most recent trajectory of TCD that has been involved with biocultural conservation, which is the governance and infrastructure in the Amazon project. And as well, our most very recently working group, where I can say that we really kind of like started to dip deeper into kind of like the concept of biocultural conservation. And I can say as well that where we kind of like try to really understand more the implications of engaging academia and into kind of like this type of effort. And so I will kind of like try to convey as well how we started kind of like with this working group, and as well inviting, and especially Bob already referred kind of like to the authors of this publication that we just submitted. And so we started this last year actually to convey this specialists, and we have one of those specialists today to give us their perspectives on biocultural education. And in terms of the experience of TCD, the the Tropical Conservation and Development Program mission is kind of like to bridge, right, the theory and practice to advance about biodiversity conservation, sustainable resource use, and human well-being in the tropics and other regions as well. And TCD has this training program, which is housed in the Center of Latin American Studies. We have 12 core faculties and with approximately 100 adjunct or affiliate faculties across the campus. And we offer kind of this interdisciplinary certificate, which is very innovative, which is basically kind of like adding value to the skills that students already get within their own disciplines. And it's very important because it is how the TCD, the program, emphasizes as well this type of learning, the perspective of learning beyond their discipline as well, and especially the capacity to think in terms of this linked socio-ecological systems, to work in teamwork, to disseminate academic work within a different framework as well, in formats, and as well to contribute as well to the students' own process within kind of like this program and their own as well critical reflection. But TCD works as well within these working groups that I was mentioning already, but as well, and the biocultural conservation is one of those. But at the same time, TCD has led us various initiatives and grants were funded as well. And one recent one, which was funded in 2019, is the grant by the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, which is called the GIA, the Governance Infrastructure in the Amazon. And so GIA had a very specific mission. It was to create and to strengthen a community of practice for learning and reflection in the use of tools and as well strategies for key Amazonian partners and stakeholders in socio-environmental governance or infrastructure governance as well, in order to reduce the threats from infrastructure development in the different region. And we worked in 4 different regions, as you see here in the map. It's the Colombian Amazon, the Peruvian Amazon of Loreto region, the Upper Madeira in Bolivia and Brazil, and the Southern Amazon in the Northern Rondonian region. And so we work kind of like with different stakeholders, indigenous communities, regional Amazonian universities, grassroots organizations as well. And during this 3 years of this life work, part of the project from 2019 to 2021, we reached up to 512 collaborators. And I would say that up to these days, we still keep in touch with a lot of those, a great number of those partners. And we definitely would love to continue working with them as well. So our work, especially as well, I would say, has been very possible as well due with these partners, because without these partners, we wouldn't have been able to actually manage and strengthen this community of practice. So, and then as well, our students that were involved in the projects, they had a history as well working with these institutions. And of course, they facilitated this trust building and built mechanisms to work in these regions. What we learned most of this time that we were with GIA is kind of like the importance to respect, to work, to collaborate with the grassroots organization. And I think this is the most relevant as well for the presentation today. I would say it's the importance of collaboration, of very equal and respectful collaboration, and as well the co-construction of knowledge. And we kind of like we're continuing working on that. Then we realized the importance, kind of like after GIA and transitioning into new moments of working together. We continued brainstorming how how to continue sharing this important work, especially from the grassroots perspectives and as well indigenous communities. So we continue this mission to strengthen the partner organizations and especially kind of like in introducing kind of like this biocultural conservation to protect biodiversity. And at the time as well, we thought as well about the climate functions as priority areas for protecting forests and rivers. And so in February 2022, we organized this conference, which is called here Forests from Voices from the Forest, which actually included the perspective of grassroots and indigenous representatives, NGOs, and we organized actually before the conference together in several sessions where we discussed as well the perspectives of the different representatives, their experiences, and as well their intercultural collaborations. And we kind of like divided it in different topics. It was collaboration, rights and governance, social bioeconomy, and territorial management and capacity building. And actually more than 100 participants participated via Zoom. At the time it was Corona time. And I think here are some infographics that depicts the themes that were discussed. And I think it's very important. I don't want to go through that, but I just kind of like to make you reflect and understand where we started, kind of like how to build the planet's future. And we need to build the future of the planet together. And kind of like these were as well represented reflections from the same representatives, the voices really from the forest, kind of like lack of implementation of free, prior, informed consent. So this was really kind of like already relevance in having indigenous knowledge reflected kind of like in all this working together with universities. So we have here the other one as well, and really incorporating as well the importance of communication, of territorial protection, of collaboration, of empowerment, this indigenous cosmovision. So this kind of like gives you a little bit of an idea. And it was, I would say, for us, kind of like a critical moment to understand that more work was needed, right? That we needed to kind of like really understand more and provide the right tools, the right, us as well, understand better the role, our own role as academia within kind of like this whole context of intercultural education and as well in biodiversity conservation. Well, this is another kind of like infographic about the panels. Again, I don't want to go through this, but just kind of like to give you really an idea of what was happening. So next, we kind of like last year, we started kind of really to get a little bit more or a step further into future actions of collaborations among academia, right? And incorporating as well the views of practitioners, community leaders, and funders to advance this whole agenda. So what we did is we worked on these 3 documents that you see here. If you're online, we will try to share the link to these documents. Specifically, there is a literature review that is on biocultural conservation, which is basically kind of like dealing with this, the concept of bioculture implementation. Then there's the white paper on how academia or how academic programs can effectively support a biocultural approach to conservation. And then we had a third one, kind of like more of an internal document that would put kind of like these approaches and principles into practice within kind of like the TCD type of model internally in our university. So I'm going to talk a little bit now or refer more to the white paper, although I'm going to give a very brief overview of the bioculture conservation as well. But I think what's a very important part of these three papers or documents is that we actually base all the documents under these two very relevant premises, which is part what I'm showing here. This the interdependence of biocultural conservation, biological and cultural diversity, and how we need to really engage in this integrated conservation strategies across these biophysical and cultural realms, and incorporating knowledge systems, spirituality, cosmovision, and as well language. And as well to really incorporate indigenous agency and empowerment. And I think these two fundamental premises are very based in those three documents that are kind of like what we are trying to work out now within TCD. And I'm just going to be referring very quick to the bioculture, the literature review. The literature review is led by our, recently he defended his dissertation, Dr. Sinomar Fonseca. And we had our point of departure here within these three questions that you see here. So what is biocultural conservation? Why biocultural conservation? How this approach contributes to addressing challenges of biodiversity and challenges of biodiversity conservation and climate change and socio-environmental justice, and how to implement biocultural conservation as well. And since academia cannot really be a direct implementer, oops, I'm kind of like trying to, so that we can. Yes.
Let me help you.
Okay, so since academia, it's kind of like not a direct implementer of biocultural conservation, that's kind of like not where academia should stand for, but can play a supportive role. And for this, we indicated, we kind of like defined as well, these 5 emergent strategies that are kind of like very, very important. And so we present these 5 key strategies for implementing biocultural conservation. As you see here, those are indigenous or community empowerment and agency, collaboration and partnership, knowledge, rights and governance, and territorial resources species management, which includes as well social bioeconomy. And now I'm going to kind of like really go into the last part, which is the second white paper, which is about how academia can contribute as well to biocultural conservation, and really gives us a framework of 3 different academic approaches to biocultural conservation. And I think what I want to say here is that actually the way that we based as well the document is kind of like thinking of a theory of change and some assumptions. So we wanna advance this framework where we assume that academia is primarily engaged, right, with the production and dissemination of knowledge, but in academia as well should and must incorporate and address the needs and the priorities as well of the potential community partners they want to engage. And academia as well and knowledge must be co-constructed, co-designed in a very transdisciplinary way. And furthermore as well, the way that academia should work is very interactively and together with incorporating indigenous and traditional communities. It must be very productive, specifically for the short and long-term outcomes for both groups, for academia and as well for indigenous communities. So this is kind of like our assumptions, our theory of change. It's kind of like what I just mentioned, is that we really need to kind of like think on these bases of how we're going to be dealing with the work of academia and how we're going to be relating as well with the work of our community partners in specifically thinking about the added value and the productive outcomes for both groups in the short terms and in the long terms. And I think we're kind of like talking about presenting these two frameworks, and I think this framework is kind of like really synthesizing the assumptions that are just kind of like presented in a theory of change, and how we kind of like propose as well to work into kind of like these three dimensions. And this is kind of like this approach for biocultural conservation. And you can see here it's classified or categorized into collaborative, transdisciplinary, and impact-oriented. So collaborative because we think that it should foster partnerships and collaboration. It should be having a shared agenda. It should be co-designed. It should be co-implemented. Transdisciplinary because we think that there need to be a recognition of dialogues, integration of plural academic and non-academic forms of knowledge, and different worldviews as well, and different ways of knowing. And in terms of impact-oriented, it's because it needs to address the need of local communities, especially what I was saying, kind of like aiming for these positive outcomes into the long term and as well short term. So in this document then, what we emphasize is specifically how academia can effectively contribute to this biocultural conservation. In order to do so, it really requires us as academia to change how we think, or rethink kind of like research, how we do education, how we do training, and how we carry all this out, and how we kind of like engage in invest in partnerships, and how we delegate power, and how we kind of like rethink these new forms of knowledge, and as well how we reframe the goals, the outcomes, right, the impact-oriented aspect. And so we kind of like recognize there need to be a change. We need to kind of like think of how to overcome this institutional and structural maybe stones on the road, kind of like obstacles, and how we can actually be more transformative in the changes that we want to achieve. And so this white paper is then kind of like a more in-depth review of a couple of literature reviews of different perspectives as well, and examples of good practices, of toolkits, of guidelines that we all analyzed. And we kind of like made a little list in terms of these three guiding principles. So we have guiding principles for collaboration, right? Here, what I think we find that collaboration calls for building trust, for building long-term relationships, for addressing relational power, for example, with specific strategies that are very transparent and kind of like designed as well for co-implementing research, education, and capacity building activities. In terms of our guiding principles for transdisciplinary knowledge, I think this calls for being more proactive, for engaging and learning more as well from indigenous and traditional knowledges, engaging with elders, engaging with teachers and mentors, at that level and co-producing different forms of knowledge and being place-based and experiential thinking. And our last one, which is the guiding principles for impact orientation, these kind of like include as well to recognize impact. The impact has multiple pathways, which includes as well always capacity building, and to prioritize rewards, impact-oriented knowledge generation and capacity building strategies, conceptualize as well scientists as interveners, right, and build capacity of scientists, envision all this process of learning as a social process that engages science and not as a scientific process, and focus more on impact through kind of like the process, not only as kind of like an application of a result. So kind of like gives us really a guidelines of how we can engage in this kind of like new role of academia. And lastly, now I just wanted to give you a little insight into the last internal document is how kind of like this, what we were analyzing and defining, how can we apply these within kind of like internally our model or within TCD, and apply kind of like these practices as well within our Andes Amazon region and elsewhere as well. So for this, we consulted as well partners and NGOs and organizations, and we wanted to kind of like to come up with an experiential pedagogy and see how we can link kind of like academic research and teaching with on-the-ground biocultural conservation practice. And here kind of like the infographic that you see here reflects a little bit this structural teaching content with specific dimensions of biocultural conservation, as well as some unique kind of like concepts and skills and approaches that are kind of like required for this effective and collaborative governance and that we see here as well. Participatory applied research aimed at documenting kind of like specific challenging as well of biocultural conservation that communities are facing, and really kind of like hands-on, real-world solution-oriented innovative teaching models. But I will stop here because I think that now it's time to really learn from an expert what they have been doing in Canada and how we can kind of like reflect on that. And so thank you so much for your attention.
Just while you're doing that, I wanted to share a practice we've started in Canada, which is a land acknowledgement. And when I was doing my research about coming to Florida, I was trying to learn about, well, what are the Indigenous communities here? I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but apparently at Contact, there was a community called Timucua. Is that how you say it?
Yes.
And I know that south of here, there are still recognized like Seminole and so on. My lament would be like, how would Florida have been different if Contact had been different, if that had been respectful cultural kind of dialogue, Europe is always viewed as this like very culturally diverse place, but actually historically North America and where I live in British Columbia, we had 30 Indigenous languages, which trumps Europe, for the number of languages. So that's my lament and my reflection. I think we need to, that's the goal, is to get some of that back, I guess. So I'll start with that.
Do you feel more comfortable here?
I can do that. Yeah, I was just waiting for you to. The title of the talk, and I'm going to start in the Amazon because this is where I've been just a recent learner, and I know that a lot of you are doing work in the Amazon, and I know just enough to be dangerous, right? Yeah. So I'll start there because that's actually one of the goals of my institute and some of my collaborators is that my university might do a field school and start doing research in that area. So when I heard that TCD was doing work there, I was like, wow, this is very serendipitous. One of my doctoral students has done a field school there for the last 10 years, and she just retired, and she's really worried that her work will slip away. So she's tapped me and introduced me to some people. So this is a picture taken in the Amazon. My presentation will be kind of a little bit of theory and a little bit of story of my experiences of doing this kind of work, and I've put my contact info there. So what kind of curriculum is needed? I'll just share a little bit about my history before I get into the more detailed stuff, but I actually trained as a wildlife biologist and was a marine biologist, and I was lonely out in the field, and I think that led me to becoming a teacher, and I ended up being a high school teacher for about 5 or 6 years, and then started teaching adult basic education, which is high school equivalency, like basically educating high school dropouts when they came back to school. That was my introduction to post-secondary, and I gradually became a college instructor and then a university instructor, and here I am. So I don't know what happened, it just one change after the other. So, whoops, back up. So my title, I'm a professor at SFU. I sort of have 2 roles. I always like to tell people, because they say, oh, you work at SFU, and I go, well, not actually at SFU very much. I work for SFU, and one of the, kind of slogans of our university is we are Canada's engaged university. So I remind our president and all that I'm engaging, the community. So a few years ago, I was granted this UNESCO chair. I'm still trying to figure out what that means. Fame, no fortune. They don't give you money. You have to align your research goals with UNESCO's agenda. And part of that has been partnership in the global south, working with other partners very closely. In BC, I founded this Institute for Environmental Learning, which it's a collaborative kind of think tank. We're like a research institute, but we're not just SFU. We're about 20 different organizations, including the BC Ministry of Education. And we're all focused on kind of working to advance environmental learning across the province, whether you work at a college or a university or whatever. So that's been my role. And, that means most of the time I'm not on campus. I'm somewhere out there in the community. So I'm going to start with a little cheeky headline from the conversation. Are you guys familiar with the conversation? Yeah. I love it because it's a nice way to kind of share knowledge to the wider audience. And I did my doctoral studies in Australia. So I love this headline. It's taken thousands of years, but Western science is finally catching up to traditional knowledge. A little cheeky, but actually pretty accurate when you get into the details. And this particular study relates this idea, Australia and Canada have been hit by a lot of wildfires recently, especially with climate change and so on. And, so these scientists, they discovered that these firehawks were like literally deliberately flying down and picking up burning sticks and moving them around to basically catch prey or, and so they discovered this, except that there were 20,000-year-old stories from Aboriginal Australians that had been observing this over millennia. And it ended up having huge implications for how you fight fire, right? If you have certain assumptions about how fire moves and you're just looking at it from a Western perspective, you're going to miss a very important part of the picture. Like birds can go over fire breaks, no problem, especially if they're doing it on purpose, right? So this has huge implications. And a really good example of how these really shouldn't be competing knowledge systems. We should be trying to synergize these. And of course, I'm, what do they call it? Singing to the choir. You guys are all on this.
Me too.
So, I think you pronounced this Leticia.
Recording in progress.
Yeah, so this is where my doctoral student has been conducting this field school with an NGO called Kalanoa. And her audience has been actually designers and architects and other such creative folks, and they come and they get inspiration from nature, and they come and do this. And they interact with a number of indigenous groups on the river, and there's some ecology learning that happens. And you know, like the Amazon is like one of those places. Like I grew up in Toronto. I read about the Amazon. I saw the media about the Amazon, and I was really surprised when I got there last spring, because it wasn't exactly how I imagined it would be from the media and from reading. My biggest surprise was how quiet it was during the day, like, because I lived on a river and it's very noisy. It's a raging river. And this river was completely silent. Like the power of it kind of blew me away. The other thing was, I used to think downtown, you know, Manhattan or Vancouver or any large city, that was a noisy place. I learned that the jungle and the insects, like at least where we were, it was louder than sirens or any, at least that was my perception. Some people couldn't sleep at all for the first 3 nights because of the noise of the insects. So for me, you know, that kind of, even though I'm an academic and an environmental educator, and I really believe in experiential ed, it really underscored for me, you can't just read about this stuff. You have to go and see it. That's an important part of the learning.
Click.
Let me go this way. None of the buttons are working.
It should work.
Let's try. Okay. So, you know, of course, biodiversity, in its own right, the Amazon is one of the most incredible places for plant biodiversity, and we know that. But again, seeing it was quite amazing. And then, of course, realizing that it was that plant biodiversity that leads to the insect biodiversity, that leads to the cultural diversity, etc. This was our friend just outside the cabin where we were staying. You know, I'm a marine biologist, but I must have seen at least 15 different species of iguana while we were there, each feeding in their own different niche. This one scared the hell out of my wife because it probably was about 70 pounds, and it fell out of the tree in the middle of the night. So it sounded like a body, you know, and when it moved, you know, we thought we were going to get mugged or something. So cacao, right? This is another, you know, like what a beautiful invention, right? Like I love chocolate. It's my get out of jail free card, you know, with my wife. It's like, I know I was an idiot, but I have chocolate, right? Like what, it's the solution to every problem. But we have really only one kind of chocolate. There used to be hundreds of kinds of chocolate. In fact, I know there's actually some genome researchers that are trying to recreate what is supposedly the best chocolate that came from Ecuador, but it's been completely extinct, and they found a museum specimen somewhere and they're trying to recreate it. So I don't know if you've ever tasted cacao before it's been processed. It's not that good, right? You need the seeds, you have to ferment it, right? Or it's not chocolate. So all this knowledge, of course, was very, you know, very clear to indigenous people hundreds, thousands of years ago. And we're happily using, you know, a rough facsimile of something that probably was much richer in the past. I know Louisa Maffei is out there. So Louisa, I'm borrowing one of your slides from our co-presentation. I hope you don't mind. I really love this very quick representation of the concept of biocultural diversity before I kind of get into my experience. I've only recently begun using this term because I don't know, UNESCO really likes this term, and a number of other places I started to see it, but I was always in other ways exploring this relationship between culture and environment. And of course, we know biological diversity, linguistic diversity, and cultural diversity are all linked. When I share this with educators, they think I'm using it as a metaphor. They say, oh, I love that metaphor. Let's talk about that. And I say, no, it's much more than a metaphor. Take a closer look. We've been taught to think of these things as separate things, but the closer you look, the more you realize that these things are related. And in BC in particular, we're noticing that the places that had the largest cultural diversity are the most biodiverse places still in our province. So it's not wild places, it's places where Indigenous people lived the longest and they actually stewarded the biodiversity. Of course, many languages are at risk, and UNESCO is aware of this. I think there are 30 at-risk languages in my province. In Haida Gwaii, which is one of the places I work, I think we're down to like 10 fluent speakers of Haida. And so they're frantically creating immersion programs and trying to learn. And it's sad when the world loses a language, but actually we also lose the knowledge that's embedded in that language, like permanently. So it's a loss for the world as a whole. This is a map that came out about 2 years ago, and it's part of what they call the decolonial atlas. So the red dots on this map show endangered languages, and the green represents, kind of terrestrial biodiversity. And you can see, similar to other maps you may have seen that Louisa Maffei and others have published, there is a correlation here that you can see between biodiversity and languages. And I'm going to share 3 stories from sort of 3 biocultural hotspots, really. I won't talk so much about the Amazon because you are all the experts there, but I will share a little bit about my work in Indonesia, and I'll share a little bit of work of Africa, and then of the west coast of British Columbia. I'll share a little bit of my work that has happened there. So this has only recently happened too. You're all probably aware of this. The Convention on Biodiversity and UNESCO have gotten together and created this program, and they're trying to develop resources. Some of the maps and figures I'll share are from that, but this is sort of a very high level realization and manifestation that this biological and cultural diversity is, I want to say, not a truth, but a truism that we're trying to explore. And I love this diagram because it starts to articulate what might be going on here and what are the relationships. So linking biological and cultural diversity, for example, from the UNESCO side, which has been traditionally more about the cultural side of things, tangible heritage, like in Haida Gwaii, we have, kind of world heritage sites that represent culture, and you can touch it, right? There are totem poles, or there is architecture to see. But there is also this notion that UNESCO calls intangible heritage, which is cultural practices and stories and oral traditions, which are harder to touch and more at risk, right? Because those are the things that we're losing in the language. But they definitely are linked to biological diversity in particular ways. Here's another figure. I don't know what happened with the heading there, but that's interesting. Some other kind of fun. So this diagram kind of starts to tease out some of the relationships. So ensembles of biodiversity, for example, are often developed and maintained by cultural groups. So that's, again, there's a few studies in my province that have shown that the most biodiverse regions of our province were actually stewarded by Indigenous people, and the wilder parts are less biodiverse, the uninhabited parts of our province. Cultural practices often depend on specific elements of biodiversity. So if you lose a species or you lose something that was important to that culture, well, then you've lost a piece of the culture as well. So, you know, there are the relationships there, and they've co-evolved. So one of the places that I've been really fortunate to live a bit and work has been in Indonesia. And I'm very fortunate because I think I was working at the university for 2 or 3 years, and I had been developing these field schools for teachers. And I guess I got a bit of a reputation for doing that because I'm really an outlier in my faculty. Like most of the people in my faculty are like, oh, I'm a math educator or I'm a science educator. And I've been this environmental educator and bringing my classes outside. So the vice president of our university, before he came to SFU, he was in charge of a project that they called the Eastern Indonesian Universities Development Project, and it was funded up by our International Development Agency, and he had lived and worked in Indonesia for 10 years, training university faculty. And our university was the host of that. And that all ended a few years before I started at SFU. And so there I was doing my thing, and the vice president calls me up and he says, we need to have lunch. And I actually thought I was in trouble. Like I thought, am I going to get fired? Like, what is this about? And, you know, long story short, he said, I want you to come to Indonesia with me. I'll introduce you to everyone I know, and then you can decide if this is a good location for a field school. So that was in 2005, and by 2007, we were running a field school there in partnership with them, and I'll share a little bit about the story. They all wanted to work with us. It was, they asked me if I wanted to try they eat everything there. Like, you know, one of my colleagues there, he said, this is the problem in Indonesia. He said, we have such biodiversity and we eat everything. You know, so they're like literally as part of their culture to eat some of these local endangered species. So we're in North Sulawesi, which is near Manado, and I'll show you where that is. Well, first of all, this is a partnership with Samratulangi University, which is in Manado, and it's like, it's one of the universities where a high number of faculty were trained by SFU or other institutions in Australia or Canada and the UK that were linked with this big project. It's one of the, if you're familiar with the term Wallachia, it's an area I'll show on the map. Let's see if I can show exactly where this is. So Indonesia, I always tell people it's 17,000 islands. It's the 4th largest country in the world by population and by area. So it's a huge, like people have this idea that Indonesia would be a small place, but it's actually a vast place, and it's very culturally diverse. And where the X is where our field school meets. And we don't go all over Indonesia. I think we land in Jakarta, which is in Java. But we don't spend much time there because it's a crazy, scary place. Like imagine the whole population of Canada living in one place. That's Jakarta with no infrastructure, and And then we go to this incredibly wild place in North Sulawesi, and they, they actually fought against the Javanese in the War of Independence. So they were kind of viewed as the 13th or the 12th colony or the 12th province of the Netherlands, because the Netherlands was the colonizer, and a very rich spice trade there. So the dominant religion there is Christian, and the people are Minahassan. Those are the indigenous people, and those are our partners. If you go to Bali, which a lot of Australians like to do, the dominant religion is Hindu, and that's a very different place than Sulawesi culturally, religiously. And then Java is where you have the sort of more Muslim culture has developed. In New Guinea, this is one of the most bioculturally diverse places on the planet. There are approximately 300 indigenous languages in Irian Jaya, that province. And there may be more because some haven't been contacted yet, and they actually resist being contacted. They will run away when researchers try to contact them. So that north tip of the island, so, having those relationships was key to this field school, because when I go there and do the field school, I'm doing my research at the same time. It might be faculty development like last summer, or it might be working with local educators, or it might be working with some of the local NGOs. But wherever we go, there's this partnership, and it's an equal partnership. My colleagues from the university there are in charge, and I'm in charge, and we kind of negotiate, sometimes right in front of the students. We'll disagree or agree, depending on what's happening. And we think actually being really transparent about that dialogue is part of the power of the program. We're literally having a north-south dialogue in front of the students. We try to engage with the local university students as much as possible too, and create opportunities for their students to be meeting our students, etc. It's an incredibly biologically rich place. Like most of the times when I've been there, there have been like active volcanoes erupting around us, and we're looking at links between that and agriculture. We're looking at, I think 80% of the species that you find in North Sulawesi are endemic, so they're not found elsewhere. And you've got this crazy zone called Wallacea, and the Wallace line depends on what kind of species you're looking at, but it's the furthest western extent of Australian, sort of species. So there's a marsupial there called a couscous, and you will find that throughout eastern Indonesia, but the last place you'll find it is in Sulawesi. And then if you go across to Borneo, you're now into the Asian kind of range of species. So there's this overlap that happens, and Alfred Russel Wallace, the famous story and the dialogues between Wallace and Darwin. So this was where Wallace was collecting. So it's neat. We actually read his journal and go to some of the places and like revisit, and that's really interesting too, because the language that they used, and like we have to almost like warn our Indonesian colleagues that this is going to be very colonial, pejorative language, and then we kind of deconstruct that as well. It's near the epicenter of marine biodiversity on the planet, so I'm in my element as a marine biologist when I go there. There literally are drownings every year from very experienced divers that become mesmerized by what they're looking at and forget to check their depth gauges and so on. It's just the biodiversity is incredible. Like I tend to snorkel there now with my students, which I'm probably sure if I asked, is that allowed? It's not allowed, but we do it off the clock. And we'll say something like, well, we should probably go in now. And then 2 hours will pass because we'll just keep noticing things on the way in that we need to look at and talk about. So rich place to learn. Let me jump to another one. Again, I'm a little bit of a teacher and a learner in this one. This is a different vice president. This only happened 2 years ago. I was on sabbatical and our vice president tapped me and he said, "Oh, we have a delegation and we're going to Africa. And I know you're on sabbatical, but I'd really like you to come." And I said, "Well, okay, I'll go." And we went there and we were partnering with the Aga Khan University. And the vice president was there and the faculty of environment dean was there and SFU International was there. And I was wondering, why am I here? I have no idea why I was tapped to be part of this delegation. And they signed all these documents. And then at the end of it, the vice president leans over and he says, "So I want you to do a field school here and I want it to happen really quickly." And I started telling him all the things that, it takes 2 years to do a field school, usually to go through all the Senate and everything. And I was telling, because he was new, and I was saying, there's the Senate Committee on International Activities, and there are all these things I have to do. And he was like, "I think I chair that committee. I might be able to help." So for the first time in my life, where in 3 months, we got this field school designed and approved, and I actually ran it last fall. And similarly, we had a local partner there. So the Aga Khan University, and I taught and worked with this fellow, Emmanuel Solé. He is from the Iraq community there. And he grew up there in Arusha, Tanzania, and he went away to school in South Africa and then to the US, and then came back and got hired by Aga Khan. So he was a local boy teaching in this new environmental living lab, and I got to work with him. So I was like, this fits the model exactly. We got a local person, we got me, we're teaching together, we're learning together, we're doing research together, because it was a brand new campus as well. So it used to be a plantation, and it was a coffee plantation, and they were renaturalizing it and planting and doing soil surveys and redesigning the buildings. And so we got to be part of that research as well. Like, how would you design a campus if you wanted a living lab? What would that look like? So they have demonstration gardens, and the local community was coming in to learn from the demonstration gardens and was impacting environmental and agricultural practices all around. So it was a neat story. Anyone see the giraffe in that picture? I didn't for a long time. I was like, when I was a kid and I went to the zoo, and I was like, wow, giraffes are very striking. Like, how would you hide if you're a giraffe? But of course, that's a giraffe out of its element. A giraffe in its element is, like you could easily miss them. They hide really well. And doesn't this look like a classic African kind of landscape when you look at the trees? Like if you've seen any of the Disney films or The Lion King, like, well, that's Africa, right? Part of what's going on there are these acacia trees. Can you imagine like this is a tree growing in a sometimes very arid region, and it's spending a lot of expending a lot of energy developing these spines. So giraffes and the 30 other ungulates that exist in Africa won't eat it, right? So small leaves, big spines works pretty well. Well, let me back up here. Apparently, the tree knows when it gets to the height where a giraffe can't graze on it anymore. And this very stereotypical shape of a tree, and you can see even in this picture where the giraffe is, once it gets above that height, the tree actually stops producing spines and starts being a very productive tree, and then just branches out and blossoms and becomes a very productive tree. So that's a kind of, classic biological adaptation that we see in the natural world all the time. Incidentally, the other thing I learned in Africa was that there isn't one kind of giraffe. There's like 7 or 8 kinds of giraffe that live. There's woodland giraffes, there's Maasai giraffes. And there are so many different ungulates. I think we have 5 in British Columbia, like I could count them on one hand, but I couldn't really count how many ungulates there are in Africa that are adapted to grazing. On the left here is a boab tree. So this is a tree that you see in Australia as well that has evolved to sort of retain water. And the animals know this. So part of why it has such a bulbous place is you'll see that the elephants will come and get water from the boab tree. They just like literally try to knock it over to get at the water. But the trees are pretty sturdy for the most part. So that's again another classic adaptation. So leaning on my colleagues' connections and expertise, we were able to visit many different Indigenous communities around and visit with elders. This is a Maasai community that is actually right in the UNESCO biosphere region of Ngorongoro, which is this incredible volcanic crater that is filled with wildlife. And it's pretty incredible to see. And you just see all of this. And I was really surprised that people were allowed to be there still. There's huge conflict happening in East Africa with the Maasai now too, and they're trying to forcibly move some of these communities. But here we have vegans. You might know some vegans. 2 of my kids are vegan, and they're very particular about what they can eat and what they can't eat. So I met the opposite of a vegan, which would be a Maasai person. They will not eat anything unless it came from one of their cattle. Milk, blood, meat. Don't try to give them a vegetable. They will react similar to a vegan with a steak. Like they just, no, we don't eat that. And they also don't harm any plants either, but their whole culture has evolved with, they have cattle, and some of the animal husbandry practices that are happening right now are actually trying to mimic what the Maasai do. They create these bomas using acacia tree branches, those big thorns. And for some reason, the big, lions and other predators, they won't prey on the Maasai cattle. And, it's not because those acacia spines, it's because we had a very long conversation with the Maasai elder. He said, as part of their culture, if a lion takes one of their cows, it's an eye for an eye. There'll be a hunting party and they will find that exact lion and they will kill that lion. And both the lions have a culture of knowing now, like they have actually co-evolved. There's this respect. And the lions will be like, well, I could take one of those, but look at what else is at the buffet. Maybe I shouldn't choose that one. And it seems like counterintuitive that a predator would stay away from a domestic animal, but the way they manage their livestock, it works and has worked for thousands of years. And I was kind of blown away seeing that. I'm going closer to home now. This is a study that came out only a few years ago and was shared at the conversation. Actually, some of my colleagues at SFU were involved with this, and they were doing some genomic research around grizzly bear populations in the northern part of my province. And, they were seeing which bears were related to which, and they created this sort of genomic maps. They found 3 really distinct populations that, didn't seem to interbreed, kept away from each other, three kind of distinct sort of communities of grizzlies living in the northern province. And they were doing that. And then I guess someone noticed that as they were mapping it, it almost identically mapped on Indigenous communities that were existing in the same area. And they were like, wow, okay, this is another example of like, not historically, this is going on right now, this sort of biocultural diversity. And there actually aren't any major geological divisions between these, like the animals could move and interbreed, but they don't. And similarly, these are three different language dialects in that area, and they mostly keep to themselves. But I thought this was very interesting, evidence of this idea of biocultural diversity and the co-evolution of ecology and culture. So now we come to probably the oldest field school that I've been doing. And I used to be a teacher up in the northern part of British Columbia, and I dreamed of going to Haida Gwaii for a long time. And when I started at SFU, I sort of inherited a field school from my predecessor, and I went to try to do it in the community that he was working in. And it didn't work for me. Like we were in Kelowna, which is a kind of an Okanagan community in the central part of our province. He lived there, had been living there for a long time, but it seemed to me that everyone living in that community was from Alberta, which is our neighboring province. And nobody knew anything about the community. They were just kind of a community of displaced people that had moved there. And I had a number of people very interested in creating links with Indigenous communities, and we tried to reach out to the Indigenous communities again in that urban area, and we had no success. Like, they were probably marginalized, they were fighting amongst themselves, and there was like no obvious group that we could collaborate with. So I thought, okay, we're going to find another place. I went to the Yukon for 1 year and did the field school up there, and that was a good experience, but still we didn't really get the connection with an Indigenous community that we wanted. And then I thought, well, Haida Gwaii, I've always wanted to go there when I was a teacher up there. It has World Heritage sites. It has, this strong Indigenous culture. I wonder if that would work. And so we went there in 2004. I remember that whole summer in really vivid detail. Like, I think in a lot of ways, it was a good idea, but it was the accidents that happened that really formulated what happened in the future. Like this summer, I'll go up and we're marking 20 years in this program. But that first year, I had 50 students that wanted to go up to Haida Gwaii, which was way too much, but I couldn't say no because it was a new field school. So we rented out the local high school. And about a week before we got there, there was an earthquake that took out the hot water heater at the school. And I was like, oh my God, I'm going to have a mutiny. I have 50 people, they can't shower. We're going to be here for a month. This is going to be a nightmare. So in desperation, I took out community passes to the local recreation center, thinking, okay, it's just across the road. They can play basketball, they can shower. It was just a logistical solution, but it changed the course of my field school completely because it meant that we were always in the community rather than just doing lectures on environmental ed. We were in the community. I met the #2 man for the Haida Nation in the sauna in the rec center, and we started chatting. And the next day he was sharing the land use agreement that they were coming up with, that they still use today. And we started getting invited to things in that community, a potlatch, a headstone moving ceremony. And I was like, throw out this other curriculum that I thought I was going to do. We're in community. This is amazing. And so we started there, and then every year we have built on those relationships. And I treat it exactly the same way as my international field school. So I go up there, I'm co-teaching with a Haida elder or somebody from the community. We're in an equal partnership, and we go up and we have those conversations. And, you know, so over the last 20 years or so, I've now had 3 or 4 graduate students that are really highly placed in that community. One of the guys I'm working with now is now the president of the Council of the Haida Nation. He's the #1 guy, and we wrote together. Actually, we were part of this book that came out just recently around Indigenous STEM education, and so we wrote a thing called Science and Story about our approach, again, of Indigenous science and Haida cultural stories, which are another form of knowledge. I kind of think of them now as like living memories, living oral histories of things that happened in the past. So another epistemology. This is a very famous canoe. This is in a museum now, but Bill Reed carved this canoe for Expo 86 in Vancouver. So it's made out of a monolithic Western red cedar. And it was drying out. And so my students, they said, we need to rehydrate the lutas, which is the wave eater. And we got to go out and paddle the canoe out in just off of Skidegate, the community we live in. So those kind of opportunities, again, kind of once in a lifetime opportunities because of this relationship with the Indigenous community and the incredible graciousness of our hosts. Like, you know, when they're allowed to run the show, and that's the way it is, at least half the time. You know, I have my syllabus and I have to lie to the higher ups because I know half of what's in the syllabus isn't what's going to happen when we get to the community, because the community has its own agenda of what they want us to do and the things they'd like us to see. This is not the clan you were talking about earlier, Bob. This is our Indigenous clan. We were talking about the other clan. Yeah, this is in West Coast, Coast Salish nations, and in Haida, they identify with clans that are animistic clans. So on Haida Gwaii, there are 2. There's the Eagle clan and there's the Raven clan. And you know, for more than 10,000 years, like if you talk to a Haida, they know that first of all, they have a matriarchal system. So if the mother is a raven, then they know they have to marry an eagle. And, you know, you kind of think, well, that's an interesting cultural practice, but it's actually population management because, you know, for the health of their community, were aware of interbreeding and like inbreeding and those kinds of things. So they had actually developed a very complex clan system because living on islands. And then the other thing they would do, the Haida were known as warriors. They would raid other Indigenous communities for women. And the reason was for that genetic diversity. It sounds horrible, but often, you know, in the history, they treated their women very well. It was kind of it wasn't a rape and pillage kind of thing. It was we need genetic diversity. We need more women. And then likewise, the clan system would do that. One of my colleagues, I actually have a tattoo that looks like this on my arm as a kind of a reminder of my commitment to that community, because often the university will say, oh, well, you don't have enough students, you can't go. And then I have to tell them, well, we are going. And, you know, you don't have to give me a teaching assignment for that, we'll just do it anyway. So I'll teach offload. I've done that at least 4 or 5 times in Haida Gwaii, and similarly in Indonesia, just to honor that kind of relational commitment you're making to the place, right? There's a whole story. This is the Wasco. I won't tell you the whole story, but I will share. I mean, there's a very long story about the Wasco, and every Haida knows it. And when you look at that symbol, the story of the Wasco is sort of told in that symbol. And one of my Haida colleagues said, they say we have an oral language. They say we don't have a written language. And he will point to the art and he'll say, that's our written language, because encoded in every artistic representation is a story, and it means something. It's not just a piece of art. There's a whole other part that's attached to that. And if you're from that culture, you'll know what the story is. So one of the challenges for me, having done these kind of field schools for a long time, and I'll have to say I really struggled in Vancouver to do similar things. I would say up until 3 or 4 years ago, I was completely a failure at trying to do this kind of taking this biocultural approach. I couldn't find a partner. I sometimes would bring my Haida colleagues down to co-teach with me in Vancouver, but that was like, you know, kind of desperate to try something and have Indigenous content in my Vancouver field school. But in a lot of ways, it was not authentic because Haida is not Squamish. Squamish is the local community where I'm working with now. So in a lot of ways, when I got appointed as a UNESCO chair, they told me that this Akatsum House Sound Biosphere region was in the works, and I knew some of the people. And they said, we really want you to work with them. In fact, they kind of made it a condition when they were vetting my application to become a UNESCO chair. They were like, you need to go talk to these people and you need to find out how you can work with them. So I actually supported their application for a biosphere region, and I've been collaborating with them. And the co-lead for that is a Squamish woman who was sort of nominally put in charge, like, you know, the optics of it. Like, she wasn't really part of the team. They said, oh, we need it. UNESCO says we need an Indigenous person, so let's put this person in. And that began a conversation, and I said, well, you need to do a better job of that, and there must be some innovative programs that are happening here. And actually, this one, the Stawama School, the Cultural Journeys program, it turned out that a lady by the name of Charlene Williams, who was the sister of the co-chair, it's all relational, right? The sister of the co-chair of the biosphere region was the cultural interpreter at this school. And so I went there and I could tell there was still this suspicion, like, who are you and why are you here? And are you really serious about collaborating with us? And I was like, I really am. I've been trying to do this for forever. So we went to the school and we had a meeting, and then she started, you know, and the meeting actually didn't start out so well. And I was telling them, well, you know, I do this, I do that. We could do these things. And then she toured me around the school, and just by luck, 4 of the teachers working in the school had been alumni of my Haida Gwaii program. And everything changed after that. All of a sudden they were like, oh, you really did work with the Haida. They're hard to work with. And then all these teachers were like, oh no, he's serious. He's been doing this for a long time. And so then we started talking. And for the last 3 or 4 years, since COVID, we've started this new program in Vancouver. And it's been, again, similarly, Charlene is my co-instructor, and her and I work together, and she leverages all her her relations and all her community contacts, and I bring the university. And we're kind of teaching the UNESCO Biosphere people how to interact with Indigenous people because they want to be part of my field school. And now the Squamish are like being part of the field school, and they're starting to have this conversation during my class, which is very cool, actually, that a field school could create a dialogue in a community that needs to happen, because this area has been very resource-based community in the past, and there hasn't been much dialogue between Indigenous and kind of Western communities. So this is my class sort of looking at a majestic Western red cedar. Again, you know, the course, this one runs on 6 consecutive weekends. So each one of them is quite an immersive experience, either involves camping. There's a mandatory attendance requirement. You can't miss any classes. There are no notes. You have to be there. I always tell people, if your grandmother dies, we'll make an arrangement. You can come on another weekend, but I will need to see the death certificate. Because, you know, students will try anything to get out of a mandatory experience. I've been told Indian weddings have been moved from one weekend to another for my course, but this is Shar. We're good friends now. I would say she's almost family. And, you know, this is, again, you know, like on the right is what we call the Douglas squirrel, named after a colonist. It's our indigenous squirrel that is very endangered because of the introduction of the European gray squirrel, you know. And I think, well, that's a beautiful metaphor for how our indigenous knowledge is at threat because of our colonist viewpoints. Exactly the same thing has been going on for, you know, over 150 years in my province. And I end with that lament. You know, we had 30 languages and cultures in BC. What would my province have looked like if we had been more respective of those other knowledge systems? So the last thing I'll share, because sort of getting back to the question, what would education look like that would promote biocultural diversity? And, you know, I sort of think of this in 2 ways. One is the message, right? So of course, biocultural knowledge and diversity, that's admirable. We should promote that. But the other way to think about it, and that's me as an educator, is what would a quality learning experience look like, right? And I think both is true here. The message is important, but actually biocultural diversity could improve the educational experience for students. It would be a richer, more engaging, more interesting when you're playing with multiple knowledge systems. It's less rote, it's more inquiry based. So I had this conversation a little bit this morning with some of the grad students, but we're creating a framework for educators to use. We're actually funded by some of the climate solutions groups, and we're saying, well, climate and environment and biodiversity loss, these are all things we need to pay attention to, but they're not necessarily learning outcomes in a specific subject. They're bigger than that. It's a kind of a way of thinking about your community, thinking about learning in general, you know. So what if you started to deconstruct how education looks? And that's what that paper was about at the beginning, right? Like how would schools look different? How would universities look different? And here are some principles that we've been hearing in British Columbia. This idea, I don't know if you're familiar with this, it's a Canadian, came out of Eastern Canada, 2-eyed seeing, which is sort of putting Indigenous knowledge systems up with Western knowledge systems. And I like that metaphor because I'm a biologist, right? I know stereo vision, you know, you play that game when you're teaching science and you realize you have no depth perception unless you have 2 eyes. And so I really love that metaphor for this, because I think if you're looking at the world through an Indigenous lens, Shara sees the world different than I see the world. And when we look together and we're equal, then, you know, we see things we didn't see before. So respect for that. It can be very place-based. I see a lot, like we have something that came out in BC a few years ago, and they call it the First Nations Principles of Learning. And I like it. It's like very motherhood like statements and things there, but there's a pan-indigeneity to it as well. So some of my Indigenous colleagues said, you know, they look at that and they don't see their community reflected there, because their community might do things slightly different than that. So that's a great starting point, but that's only the starting point. You have to engage in community and like learn, well, how is knowledge created in this community, and respect the locality of it. Experiential learning, as I've talked about. Inquiry, are you guys familiar with the 5 E's of inquiry? That's like a big thing in science education. Engage, explore, elaborate, evaluate, I think, extend, evaluate. So it's Roger Bybee from years ago, and it's been decades, you know, that's been a way to do inquiry. Well, we have a version of that in BC, and they call it the 7 E's. You add environment and you add elders. I really like that model, so we're including that in our framework. We have an interdisciplinary framework that we call CARE, which is a clever acronym: complexity, aesthetics, responsibility, and ethics. So the way that environmental thinking can be infused across any discipline, not just science. And then the importance of cross-cultural communication. And the most powerful form of communication is in action, right? There's as an environmental educator, I've had to face this so many times where like accidentally walk in with like a disposable coffee cup or something like that, and then my students will like react. Whoa, you call yourself an environment? And then I'll get a lecture about the cup, and I'll be like, well, I rode my bike here this morning. How did you get here? And they would like have driven their car, and I'd be like, moral high ground, you know, but like they are watching. And like I have so many reusable coffee cups at my house right now, because I realize even when I don't think I'm teaching because they're looking at me as a role model. So that's the ethics part, right? So, and so, yeah, I think I'll end there. That's me. I put my contact info up there too. I'm really incredibly excited and honored to have been invited here, and I'm hoping this is the end of my presentation and the beginning of future collaborations. So